All right, so we're going to start our last big unit here. The last section we're going to do in this class is just a little bit about health and applied social psychology, but we're going to spend the next 3 days talking about stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. And I hope as we go through this, you see a lot of the DNA of other things we've talked about this semester going through this unit. I think it's one that subsumes a lot of other things. And combines them in a really interesting way that shows how important they all are, from social cognition to social perception and attitudes and conformity and pro-social behavior and some fundamental things about relationships. A lot of those different processes are going on and influencing how we interact with people from other groups and with people in our own groups. So, stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, again, very broad, important topic, and when it comes to mind for a lot of people, you think of very heavy historical events that were the product of prejudice and discrimination. And those types of events were the sorts of things that have influenced a lot of the study of stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination over the years. We've talked a little bit about some of those things over the course of the semester, that many social psychologists in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s were inspired or driven to study group processes and prejudice because of experiences they had directly or indirectly as a result of the Holocaust and World War II. Other social psychologists, in particularly the 80s and 90s, were African American psychologists that were, driven to do work because of the way that their communities had been impacted by lots of things in the history of the United States. That slavery is a very impactful thing, obviously, to make the understatement of all time. That still has its reverberations throughout how we interact with people today, whether we're conscious of those structural influences or not. But prejudice is not just these big things. It's not just slavery and exterminations and genocides and unspeakable violence. That is, in some senses, the worst outcome from prejudice or discrimination, but it's not the only manifestation of it. Other things that have to do with prejudice and discrimination are, not giving people all of the same sorts of rights. So keeping the franchise and voting from people, not letting people use the same facilities, not letting people have the same access to civil processes like marriages or being able to buy and afford a home and get a loan, being able to, get support from the government. All of these sorts of things are obviously also types of prejudice, types of discrimination that depend on your group identities. And different people from different groups have been the target of discrimination over the years, but we'll talk about how those things both change and do not change in some sort of insidious ways. But there are, other examples of discrimination too, and we could spend an entire class just going over, the types and extremities of discrimination. But just to kind of bring it down to, the I don't want to say least consequential level, but a less consequential level, is to think about how people used, language and groups in a, quote unquote, mildly disparaging way or in a jokey way or something like that. Portrayals of people and using language about people to portray something negative, even if it's in a joking manner, also are manifestations of stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. And these things, might be laughed off in some scenarios or might be seen as harmless in others. But I want to draw your attention to how these same sorts of cognitive processes that can lead to violence or exclusion are involved in the sorts of things that are going on when you use negative language about a particular group, like using a stereotype about somebody as a joke, even if that stereotype is positive. Seeing people as part of a big monolithic group and not allowing them their individualism or agency, or using language to make them feel less than, whether you're doing it on purpose or not, these are involved in the same sorts of processes. So I'm not saying that, using a slur or making a joke about a stereotype are the same as excluding somebody from being able to vote or killing somebody, obviously, but they have some of the same processes in common. So a big question for research in this area in general is, what is prejudice? And the terminology here is a little slippery in some ways, that sometimes people use prejudice to talk about everything that falls under the stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination rubric. So if people are talking about it in this really general way, we might think about prejudice as a negative attitude toward a group of people based solely on their membership in that group. So some negative association that comes to mind about a group. And it's not about individual people's characteristics or anything. It's about what you believe about them because of their membership in that group. And I think it's really important to emphasize that this knows no bounds, basically. It can be because of literally any group membership. We tend to think most about discrimination and prejudice when it has to do with race, ethnicity, gender, religion, age, maybe more recently political or ideological affiliation. Obviously, there are prejudicial things associated with ability or disability status, weight, attractiveness, these sorts of things. But the way the human mind works is that we have these associations that we can apply to literally any category that we're capable of conceptualizing. So your Greek organizations, your major, your neighborhood you live in, the state you live in, the music you like we have group memberships that span all sorts of things, from very meaningful to maybe less so, but we're capable of forming stereotypes and discriminating against people and having prejudicial reactions to them based on any of those memberships. It's just that some in the contemporary world matter and are more impactful, matter more and are more impactful than others. I think it's also really important, though, to think past this relatively straightforward definition of prejudice and think about it in pieces. And I want to do this in a way that calls back to a lecture that we did on attitudes, where I distinguish between this unidimensional view of an attitude from a tripartite view. So remember, this unidimensional idea is that we have associations with things that might range from negative to positive. One dimension, unidimensional. So you can think about this as that general way of thinking about prejudice on the last slide, that it's just this general negative attitude on one dimension. But we know that attitudes are much more complicated than that. They're not just one thing. They can be broken down, and you can have multiple, pieces of each of these part of attitude. So remember when we talked about this tripartite view, attitudes can be broken down into affective, cognitive, and behavioral components. Affect meaning things like emotion, feelings, general associations, cognitions being thoughts, beliefs, behavior being actions or responses. So this is a really important distinction that I think explained a lot in how we thought about attitudes. And you can think about prejudice or negative attitudes towards groups being broken down in much the same way. Prejudice, generally, if you're going to talk about it in a more specific way, I know it's kind of confusing that prejudice is like the name of all of it and the name of a particular component, but prejudice in this conceptualization we'll think about as emotions or affect towards a group, so negative feelings toward a group. Stereotypes are the cognitive component. They're the specific thoughts and beliefs about a group, the characteristics you think they have, the activities you think they engage in. And discrimination is the behavioral component, the actual actions that you might be undertaking to exclude a group or hurt them or keep them from having some sort of positive outcome. So, keep this in mind as we go through that just like an attitude is broken down into affect, cognition, and behavior, your negative attitudes about a group are broken down into affect, cognition, and behavior in the forms of prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination. So, we're going to go through all these things in turn, stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, spending relatively more time on stereotypes and discrimination. But to start talking about stereotypes, I want to do a quick activity. So I'm going to show you a bunch of statements describing somebody performing a particular behavior. And you'll notice that on the side, there's going to be either an A or a B for every person. So I just want you to, don't write anything down, don't take any, notes or tallies or anything. Just watch this as I scroll through and try to, form an impression. Try to get an idea of what people from group A are like and an idea of what people from group B are like. So you'll see a bunch of these different statements, you'll try to form an impression, and then via Canvas, after this lecture, you will go and respond with your impressions. I'll ask you 4 questions about these different groups. And then in the next lecture, Prejudice 2, I'll explain a bit about why we did this. So I'm just going to cycle through these, and then at the end, I'll again remind you to go to Canvas to finish that activity. Okay. Okay, so this is the end of this video. Please go to Canvas and complete the activity called 420 participation, Group A and Group B. Just a few questions. The one at the beginning, just answer that to get credit, and then there's 4 questions about these groups. And then come on back for the second Prejudice lecture.